обеда у нас работали 4 параллельные сессии под общим названием «Основные факторы и препятствия в изменении парадигмы». В частности, работала сессия по демографии, экономике, экологии, по социально-культурным вопросам, по интеллектуальным и научно-технологическим факторам и, наконец, сессия, посвященная управлению и безопасности. Значит, согласно от регламенту и согласно схеме проведения нашей конференции, сейчас на этом заседании мы предоставим слово в первую очередь руководителям сессий параллельных. Они отчитаются. Значит, время где-то до 10 минут, не больше. Пожалуйста, придерживайтесь регламента. Отчитаются об основных итогах работы сессии и, конечно, самое главное, о тех предложениях, которые возникали в ходе работы сессии, и, значит, те предложения, которые в конечном итоге войдут тем или иным образом в наш окончательный документ, который называется резолюцией от нашей международной конференции. Поэтому позвольте приступить к обсуждению работы сессии и предоставить слово, значит, Роберто Печии, который был модератором на сессии «Демография, экономика и экология».
So thank you very much. My job is to report on the first session today, which was on deep drivers and barriers to the paradigm change. I was very lucky to have Dr. Medeo as my co-moderator, and we controlled a great crowd that was actually very engaged in the discussion. And I also like to thank Adam Koniski for his very good presentation on the problem. Now, if you think about deep drivers and barriers to paradigm change, you have to begin thinking about how do you find a path to solutions. And a path to solutions, you need to understand the problem more deeply. You need to understand both the barriers that make it difficult to make a paradigm change, and also the drivers that maybe will move you in the right direction and on occasion move you in the wrong direction. So we began by discussing the drivers and the barriers on 3 different things: demography, economy, and ecology. That was enough for a session, actually. You could have had many more sessions than that. And I think if you talk about demography, the first thing that became clear is that we're not yet clear whether we are near a demographic transition. If you look at the projections of the UN, they believe that maybe population will flatten around 2050 at about 9.5 billion. On the other hand, population right now is 7.2 billion, and we're adding 80 million a year. Now, 80 million a year times 12 is 1 billion. So we're adding 1 billion every 1,000 years. That is very, very, very much. And indeed, if we do not lower that rate, we will be over the 9.5 in the year 2050. If you think in terms of economy, probably the biggest barrier, and at the same time an important driver, is the fact that we must change the economic system that we have. The economic system that we have is a driver toward unsustainability. So how do you change the economy in a way that it becomes more sustainable, indeed that you get to a sustainable future? And there, I think a very good comment was made from a discussion, is that the problem is that we have no philosophy for what is the future economy. So we must think about what philosophy this future economy is based on. At the moment, the philosophy is markets, free markets. The free markets do not take into account of many things like natural capital, and so it is very important to arrive at the right economy. And finally, you can summarize what you have to say about ecology in a very simple statement. It is impossible for us to continue having a footprint that is greater than 1. We cannot be consuming the natural capital that we have so that future generations won't have any. It's not that the earth will not survive, it's just that we don't survive, which is perhaps a problematic statement. So we began looking at this problem, and Adam had a very nice graph of a traffic jam in Beijing, which, if I remember correctly, lasted 6 days. 10 days, okay, 6 days, 10 days, who cares? But he posed as a barrier, imagine China with 1 car for every 3 individuals, so with 500 million cars. Not a good thing to think about. Now, when we began discussing things, it was quite clear that there were a characteristic in that we had both the driver and the barrier could be characterized by the same quantity, and that is that the barrier toward a paradigm change is us, and the driver toward a paradigm change is us. That is, it is possible to change human quality such that it will think of future generations in a different way that it does now, and therefore it could help, or we could revert to a case in which indeed we are impeded to move toward a paradigm change by us because we think short term, we do not think long term, all the litany of things that you're all aware of. One of the things that emerged is that no matter what the barriers and the drivers are, the only way that you really would think of getting toward a paradigm change is through education. You actually need to make sure that there's a change in human quality, and in particular the young people, of which I see some very nice T-shirts saying they love Kasnu, very nice thing. It is really the future generation that will make a difference. Now, a couple of more things that I wanted to say, which were important, is that if you think about the future and you think about how you get to the future, one of the discussants said, you cannot get to the future by starting from the present. The only way that you can actually get to the future is you imagine the future. And then you go back to the present, and then having imagined the future, you go back to the present, and then you move toward that path toward the future. And I think that is a very important concept. We must really invent a future that we think is a future where we can all coexist in this earth. And unless we invent that kind of future, we will never move toward a paradigm change. So this idea of thinking about the future, thinking of what future we want, going back to the present and beginning to make the kind of changes that are important for that. Now, perhaps the simplest example of that, and one that it really pains me that we're not doing, if you think about the future of energy, it is quite clear that 50 years from now, 75 years from now, we will have a completely different energy system than we have now. So if we go back to today, why are we not moving in that direction, thinking that's the future, and we're still subsidizing fossil fuel production by enormous amounts? So then the last sort of little bit that I can tell you about our session, we had a discussion of numbers, enormous numbers. So for example, the amount that it will take to actually mitigate climate change has been estimated to something like $40 trillion. A trillion has 10 to the 12 zeros, lots of zeros, important to remember. $40 trillion means that we need to spend $1.5 trillion a year to get to mitigate these things by 2050. $1.5 trillion a year is a lot of money. What are we spending toward moving toward renewable energy? We're spending $250 billion a year. So we're underspending by a factor of 5 every year. So that's a big number to try to change. So it is quite clear there are barriers and there are some drivers to get to a paradigm change. But I think the most important message I guess from our session is this message of thinking of the future, going back to the present, and then aiming to the future that you want. Thank you.
Так, спасибо.
You want some more questions? Question? Oh, okay. I can sit down here. I found a seat.
Так, ну, уважаемые коллеги, со-модератор данной секции академик Ахмед Калмидов отпросился, но обещал предоставить все это в письменном виде. Так.
We can pose questions afterwards. Let us now continue with track number 2. And I'm asking Winston Nagin to report as a moderator on what was going on in the morning in that track number 3, devoted to social and cultural deep drivers of paradigm change.
The panel was meant to be moderated by the former president of Romania, but he couldn't make it, and the main speaker didn't quite get his visa organized, and so I understand that after arriving in Almaty Airport, he was packed off back to Canada. And so we had to put this panel together, and I agreed to moderate, and Alexander Vigarov agreed to be the presenter in the place of Ruben Nelson from Canada. Our task was to consider the social and cultural facilitators or barriers to paradigm change. And initially this looks like a fairly simple thing, but once you begin to unpack it, it gets to be nightmarish. In part, this is because our understanding of human nature is not altogether clear. If we look at culture and personality, we'll tend to see that culture provides continuity and therefore is resistant to change. So we would have to conclude rather simplistically that culture is an impediment to paradigm change. On the other hand, we could look at the human personality as not simply a mechanistic bearer of culture, but as an energized force that manages, if you like, manipulates and changes culture. In short, human beings are also endowed with the faculty of reason and reasoned elaboration and choice making. In that sense, culture isn't a force that compels the human personality to just blindly follow whatever tradition has required. In effect, that means that we, as human beings, are confronted with the, if you like, the dilemma or perhaps the challenge of culture and continuity and culture and change, which is inherent in the nature of the human personality, with its capacity to make choices, and hopefully to make choices that are an improvement on the previous scheme. So that is sort of one of the challenges that we had to consider. And Alexander Liketal suggested there is no quick fix to this problem. Absolutely no quick fix. We can't easily substitute culture for choice, and we can't substitute choice for culture. It's a more complex issue that we have to be concerned about. And so we are confronted with that dilemma that, in a sense, culture may resist choice, but personality may have this dynamic element that demands choice. And we're caught in this, if you like, existential dilemma. Now, to transpose that into the global picture, well, there is the question of globalization. And then the question is culture a denominator, in effect, today of global culture? And if that is true, is local culture not threatened by global culture? And how much of local culture should we preserve and ferociously protect from the contaminations, if you like, of global culture? Now, that's a more complex discourse, and one of the issues that emerged there was, well, some aspects of global culture reflect a form of global imperialism, so that the states or societies that have a monopoly over the means of communication export global culture, subvert local culture. And then the question becomes, well, what's the challenge for local culture? Is it to resist globalization, or is it to adapt if it can, and if it won't be overwhelmed by these, shall we say, forces of global culture? So that discourse then raised the question of the implications of global values and global and local human rights questions. And some of the discussion that emerged from that was that, well, is it possible that human rights are simply a form of Western imperialism? And at least some of us suggested that, well, perhaps this is a grotesque oversimplification of the universality of the values behind human rights. In short, even the people who drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights came from different cultural backgrounds, so the charge won't necessarily hold in this sense. On the other hand, when we look at the values behind the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they have an anthropomorphic basis. That is to say, the values are relatively constant in terms of what human needs and human demands are. The question then is, what are the institutional mechanisms that cross-culturally we invent to give expression to those fundamental values? And these institutions differ remarkably from one culture to another, and that then raises the question of, if the institutions differ, to what extent are we challenged to change the institutions to make them conform in a more important sense to what we conceive to be the true and important expressions of these fundamental values in global society. So those were some of the themes that emerged, and the question also emerged about the role of human capital in this framework of cultural and social impediments or enhancements for a new paradigm. And there was some concern that the concept of capital as applied to the person would tend to dehumanize the person. You reduce the person to some sort of capital-style mathematical equation, and humanity is lost, so there's some value lost in the model. We never resolved that in the discourse, but certainly that was a question that was raised. And then some of the discussion did emerge about the question of whether there's an important role for a bridge between so-called Western and so-called Eastern values, and that is a particularly important issue for a state like Afghanistan, which is sort of on the cusp of a paradigm between different cultural modes. And some of the discussion did see that the position of Kazakhstan, in a sense, was an important bridge to a better understanding and a better reconciliation of values from a global perspective. Finally, we did have some discussion about the problems of modern or modernism and postmodernism, and the concern that, at least in the West, postmodernism tended to be somewhat chaotic about the coherence and consistency of values. I'm not sure that that was not somewhat overstated. But one of the issues that emerged from that discussion was the question of how should a human being live? And that does overtake some of the important contemporary philosophical concerns, namely that major philosophers have said that every human being on the planet should have an ethical obligation to do as much as the person can to ensure that the life is not a wasted opportunity. That is, in effect, a successful experience. And from that, if that's an ethical principle that binds you, then the follow-up question is, and what about non-self others? And if you want that for yourself, how can you deny it for non-self others? So we have a workable principle here that does give some space and some importance to the individual human being as a generator of value in our social processes. So those are some of the themes that we took up. We didn't come to a specific conclusion on them. And I think this conference still has to clarify precisely the importance of the human being as the center and focal concern of a global social process and as a generator of change in that global social process, because I think personally, at the end of the day, if the individual human being doesn't claim anything, nothing happens. Thank you.
Thank you, Winston. I propose that we leave the questions for the end of the reports, when we finish with the reports on the parts of the session. That has been the report on social and cultural deep drivers, the paradigm change. Let us now switch to the intellectual, scientific, and technological deep drivers of the change. And I'm calling Pushpa Bhargava to give us a summary on that part of the session. Please.
In this session, we looked at 10 agents of paradigm change. The one that was considered the most important and the largest emphasis was laid on it is education. Education, education, and education, as it was said. Flexibility in education, accessibility so that everyone has access to it. Quality of education emphasizes ethics, environment, and human identity as contrasted to other parochial identities. What is the minimum amount of education that everyone should have so that one will discharge one's responsibilities and claim one's rights? Professional education, vocational education, general education, and education of policy makers, which is considered as very important. 2, science. But it has to be the right kind of science, and science should include social science. We recall that how Darwin's enunciation of the theory of evolution did lead to a paradigm change in our thinking about our origins. Then 3, technology. An example would be the cell phone, how it has changed our lifestyles and the way we look at many things. The facilities that we have today for travel, which has brought the world so much nearer to us. It was very interesting to listen to the fact that the GDP of Kazakhstan is high compared to other neighbors and countries, related countries, and that's on account of technology. But again, the technology must be the right kind of technology. 4, resources, water, power, and other natural resources. 5, infrastructure, transportation, roads, railways, air, sea. Communication, automation and computerization. For example, the creation of social media as a result of advances in computer science. Then 6, forms of government, extent of democracy that we have and the rule of law that we practice. 7, human capital and social capital, which would include demography, percentage of young people, percentage of older people, and the related problems of age of retirement and social and the provision of social security. 8, religious liberalism, emphasis on values rather than on dogma. Religious liberalism as opposed to religious fundamentalism, which can be a very important barrier to beneficial paradigm change that will ensure sustainable development. Next one, 9, historical background, the perception of history. For example, the Pope today accepting evolution of man according to Darwin and the Big Bang theory of the origin of universe. That certainly will lead to a paradigm change in the thinking of the Catholic world. And lastly, cultural factors. The 2 cultures of C.P. Snow plus the social sciences culture making it 3 cultures. And these cultural parameters, which vary from place to place, sometimes are undefinable, but extremely important. So in summary, we had a discussion on these agents of paradigm change. And I like to emphasize that education was the one that was mentioned by everyone and is perhaps the single most important agent that can bring about paradigm change that will ensure sustainable development. Thank you.
Okay. The next session called the Governance and Security, and as a moderators were Tibor Tots from Austria and Merivat Abusaitova. And first of all, I would like to give the opportunity to speak to the Tibor Tots about the results of this session.
Thank you so much. We had no casualties before the meeting from among the officers of the session. There might be one serious casualty as a result of the session, that the presenter, David Harris. We ended up with 13 unanswered questions. David Harris promised that from 11 tonight in the bar of the hotel, there will be an exploration of some of the answers. We were lucky to have David Harris as a presenter who is a member of the board of directors and with the Canadian Global Initiatives Project and Protels, and the co-moderator who is Merivat Abusaitova, who is the head of office of the Institute of Oriental Studies within the Kazakh Ministry of Education and Science. The discussion was very well defined by the introductory points of our presenter. Practically, he structured the discussion along the following lines: which are the main domains or elements to define the scope of governance and security and the intersection. Number 2, there was a definition of the drivers, the main drivers. Number 3, no surprise, we address the barriers to pursue these goals, and some cross-cutting issues were mentioned. So let me start with the 5 domains or elements to delineate the scope of governance and security. Number 1 was national security, no surprise about that. Number 2, homeland security, as something which is becoming more and more relevant as a result of the last 15 years. The issue of public safety was considered as one of the defining elements. Very close to that, the ability to respond to disaster type of situations, and it can be man-made disasters or natural disasters. And what was defined as the worst thing, these are unexpected major calamities, a meteorite or a space object hitting the Earth and creating unprecedented havoc. The drivers, 5 drivers were enlisted, and the very first one, probably in terms of prioritization as well, the intensification of the contradictions. The way it was described, that those global issues are becoming bigger, wider, and deeper. In that context, an interesting point was raised about the scarcity of space, and here what was meant not outer space, but the physical land space. And it was made in the context of the projected increase of the population from the present 7+ million to potentially 12 million. So it's another 5 million like it was added from the beginning of the 20th century. And in that context, it's clear that only 30% of the surface of the globe is land. Extreme weather was mentioned as the next driver. I do not have to go into that, but it's creating very serious dilemmas for those who are to deal with the consequences, to move population or leave the population, and what are the implications of one or the other. No surprise, number 3, arms race and the armaments, and the numbers were coming back in different contexts. $1.5 trillion per year spent on military budgets. A number was mentioned, $350 billion in the next couple of days spent on nuclear arsenals, just in one country, and the contradictions between official emulated policies and the reality on the ground in terms of the dynamics of the arms race. Driver number 4, democracy as an important tool, as a positive driver, and the complexities when there is an abuse or misuse of democracy. Elections hijacked was one example mentioned. Number 5, driver number 5, mass of information, not mass information, but mass of information. This is practically overwhelming information, and how to make sense of it. There was a very practical reference just in the intersection of sustainable development and security based on the information gathered by the institution of David Harris. Around 670 organizations which are doing one or another type of activities. It's absolutely clear from the research that many of them do not know about each other, do not communicate, or do not work together. The barriers element was bringing up more cultural and conceptual issues than very tangible issues. So, first of all, what was mentioned that collectively we shouldn't bang our heads against the wall. At the same time, the phenomenon of willful blindness was referred to. Later on, there was a reference to something which is in psychology called cognitive dissonance, where the smokers do not acknowledge the dangers of what they are doing. Among the barriers, number one, no one would like to be necessarily the messenger of bad news. Two, there are issues among these global issues, if not the overwhelming majority of them, which are too hard, and there is a tendency to set aside issues. There is an element, this is number three, the moving target. So yesterday is different compared to today, and tomorrow will be different as well. So in a way, it's complicating the task of focusing clearly on issues. And as a corollary of that one, the tools are not relevant from yesterday for today, and even less for tomorrow. Cross-cutting discussion. Here there was a sort of exploration of the relationship between what was called by or presenter as solution, and the relationship towards solutions of progress. And a strong point was made about progress you can defend compared, and this is something I heard for the first time, too big to solve. Not too big to fail, but too big to solve. So this is the dilemma, and there was a very interesting discussion later on how the participants were looking upon, okay, if we have an incremental approach, where is it leading us? Are we getting there where we should be? Another dichotomy is integration versus interoperability. So there was a strong feeling of our presenter that integration is not something we should collectively strive for, but it should be interoperability. And no surprise, from the ensuing discussion, there were views totally contradictory, and this will be one of the important issues of the 11 o'clock p.m. continuation of the exploration. Education came up as well. Education, first of all, to focus on the next generation, and education which is not really education but more training. An interesting idea, training the present generation of unemployed people who didn't have even the first job, to help to improve the state of play in areas which are hit by natural calamities. As a moderator, I tried to further confuse the discussion, so I injected a couple of questions which I myself consider provocative. Whether in the area of security and governance, number one, whether we have a model to describe what we are speaking about. Number two, can we measure progress or lack of progress? Do we have a GPS? And number three, if we don't have a clear model to know what we are speaking about and no measurement tools, how we are trying to mitigate the things which are to be mitigated. Substance-wise, as for the model, there was a reference to the financial economic crisis and the bubbles which were building up prior to 2008. And the question was, could it be that if things are neglected, mismanaged, we are building up a security bubble? And the next question was, if there is a potential security bubble, will it burst or not? And if it is bursting, as it happened in 2008, would it become just the Great Recession, as financial economically we are speaking about the Great Recession, or would it become the Great Depression equivalent? And the reference point for a Great Recession is the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Great Depression equivalent is World War I. And the idea is not to have the type of irrational exuberance which the financial community was showing back to before 2008, just saying that yes, there is an irrational exuberance, but number one, there is no bubble, it will not burst, and 1939 will not be repeated. And the last word was, oops, we dropped the ball. So this is something which we cannot do, and these are questions, but these questions we have to be addressed through a model, through a measurement, and through clear mitigation. The discussion brought up so many issues that, as I mentioned, we ended up with a long list, just highlighting some of them. What is constraining the major powers who are participating in a qualitatively accelerating arms race not to do the wrong thing? How not to overdo? There was another question about the measurement or the lack of measurement. So exactly how to measure the progress or lack of progress in security. Very important question, territorial integrity in the context of self-determination. So can we prioritize what is the relationship and the dynamics between the two? How to be able to open and close a Pandora's box of globally of so-called impossible conflicts. In the context of conflicts, there was an interesting reference to the decreasing number of interstate conflicts due to important economic growth in major areas, due to UN peacekeeping improved and the NGOs. And compared to that, nuclear disarmament and the stalemate in nuclear disarmament. An important point, reference to Kazakhstan and the role of Kazakhstan in being an important leader in practical steps toward disarmament, the efforts of Kazakhstan in the context of prohibiting nuclear weapon tests, closing down a test site, giving up an arsenal, which used to be the arsenal number 4 of nuclear weapons worldwide. I should add from my own knowledge, giving up elements of fuel cycle, an important set of contributions. So open discussion about where we are going, new concepts to be embraced like spirituality applied to some of these defining issues, how transboundary security and human security can be embedded as a hard rock of security, how to exercise the responsibility of states to protect, what kind of mechanisms should be better relied on, not just the UN, but civil society as well, and how to strengthen the rule of law and different regimes. So this is where David Harris said we have certain unanswered questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Todd, for kind report. And the next speaker is co-moderator of this session, academician Mirieta Vusitova from Institute of Oriental Studies.
The distinguished scholars and experts. So thank you very much, my colleague, that he did the full speech about our session. and he said about all questions that were in our session. But I added some maybe proposals, because our session governs at the security, and I should to pay attention on not only our global world, but maybe on some challenges that are just now we found not only in Kazakhstan but in Central Asia too, because our auditory in Kazakhstan is very interested in these questions too. I see that our another session that will be tomorrow with Kuralay Bayzakova, but we today in our session set and some our proposals were in the context of a transformation of the world and transformation of geopolitical and geostrategical processes, and I should to connect this with our region, Central Asia. And so, because these challenges are very, very strong just now, these challenges not only military, that we spoke about these problems, but these challenges are religion, extremist and terrorist, and these all questions and contradictory problems, they connected with not only with our dialogue, but we should have some approaches, concrete approaches that will be maybe on the base of historical materials, because just now our scholars, Kazakhstan scholars, they found many materials on these history approaches, on the maybe devoted to these problems that we just now we have in our session. And these problems had a very, very deep history, maybe roots. And if these deep roots, we cannot maybe to resolve these problems very soon. And we should to analyze these processes together. Maybe it will be our international projects of not only experts on specialists on defense, but in international relations, historians, and based on interdisciplinary base. This is my proposal, because this initiative of our president, G Global, is not only dialogue between all our experts, but I see that it will be some maybe collective maybe projects, research projects between not only Kazakhstan researchers, but with the researchers of who just now just now came to our conference. This is the second proposal, and so in conclusion, I should say that it's my proposal. Maybe who supported the proposal, but maybe we publish some materials of our this global conference. It will be the good materials on analyzing of these processes that are just now not only in the world but in our regions. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Берет Хоффман, оставайтесь, пожалуйста.
We have heard the reports about the morning's session, the 4 reports, and I'm thanking very much the people, the participants who have made the reports. And now it's time to go to questions and discussions related to the whole session devoted to deep drivers and barriers to change. And I'm asking the participants from the audience to pose questions and to give comments, and please make the comment brief, at least 2 minutes. The floor is open, please, questions and comments. Who should be the first? Gary? Please.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all the presenters and moderators for very interesting insights. I was very encouraged to see that the theme of education was crossing all of the spectrum of all the issues, because it's really a good example of a driver that is driving the forward evolution of global society. And a good question for us, and a question we've put before the World University Consortium, is how effective is the present paradigm of education? We have a whole session on it, I think tomorrow or the day after. So it's a topic we're going to come back to and explore in much greater relevant detail. Under the session on social and cultural, I thought it was a very interesting discussion on the cultural aspects, but I'm not sure that I heard as much on the social drivers. And I just wanted to mention them. Maybe the summary didn't fully reflect all of the discussion, because they are so important. If we think about a new paradigm change, any significant social change is going to be driven by changing social consciousness or awareness, and the social organization through which that consciousness and awareness expresses itself. And we do have very substantial drivers increasing and changing our awareness as a global society, education being one of them, the internet being another. In developing countries, it's something I mentioned in one of the sessions this morning, rising expectations in countries like India, where the expectations of the people are rising very rapidly, and that increases awareness and interest in what's going on elsewhere. On the side of social organization, of course, education is one of our greatest social organizations. The internet is one which offers unimaginable potential for the future, and if we're thinking about how to get to a future, we need to think about how to use all of our social institutions or organizations, and of course civil society, of which we have many represented in this room. So I hope that in our comprehensive look at social and cultural drivers, that we can come up with a full list, a full inventory of the social capabilities, social resources, how they're developing, how they can be utilized. I'll try to be brief. I'd just like to make a couple other comments on other sessions. In the session on governance and security, I thought was very interesting contributions. On barriers, there was no specific reference, but I think one of the critical barriers we have to the evolution of governance is the dominant role of money in the operation of government institutions, including democratic institutions in most countries of the world, whether it's the corporate sector or whatever. And I think that is a real barrier to democracy playing the real role it has to play in the future of the world as a change agent. And the second one, a little more specific on the issue of democracy, because this is a session on governance and security. The existence of nuclear weapons, which is such a concern both to the Academy and to Kazakhstan as a country, seems to me to be incompatible with the real effective operation of a democracy. Because in a democracy, the acts of the government should express the will of the people, but in a country with nuclear weapons, no nuclear weapon system in any country is under the control of the people or even accessible to, there's no time for the population or even for the government, even for a parliamentary democratic government to act. Every country that has nuclear weapons, the power is ultimately in the hands of a couple of people who have to take a decision on 5 minutes notice or 10 minutes notice, which is completely antagonistic to the principle of democratic representative government. Thank you.
Other questions and comments, please? Please.
Thank you, Yuda Kahana from Tel Aviv. I'd like to make a short comment about the education. I think that the main issue here is the education of managers and leaders, and preparing people to be leaders. To be a leader today is very difficult because all the information and the power is in the hand of every person in his smartphone, because people have the access to all kind of information that the leaders of firms and leaders of organizations and leaders of countries don't have any advantage. So you have to retrain them to do things differently and just to be a unifying power in a very split society. The leaders have to, first of all, to be educated to look at things differently, to change the screens that are preventing them from seeing reality as it is. That's one thing. The second thing that they have to be educated is to be educated to be cooperative. All the games from childhood, we are educated to be competitive. And even the games, Monopoly, all the games that people are playing are competitive. And you know, in school, you're supposed to work by yourself, not cooperate with people, not to open the books during the exams. In reality, you don't face situations like this. And so people have to learn it in a different way. Not being competitive is very difficult to learn. There is an Israeli company that they invented a new table game like Monopoly, but it's a cooperative game. And we used it in some of the courses that we give. We use this game, and it's amazing because managers see in that game, they don't know the rules. They have to define, you know, beside very simple rules of the game, they have to invent the rules. And they learn in no time that being cooperative enables them to reach their goals much faster, and it enables everybody to reach their goals much faster and much higher goals. It's an amazing game. I highly recommend it. It's called Fresh Biz. I highly recommend it. I have no interest in it. If I have 1 minute, I'd like to tell you a small story. A few years ago, I decided to go, that ice is melting and I won't have a chance maybe to see ice in real time. I live in a sunny country. So we took a trip in the middle of the winter to Lapland. So it was really a nice tour, on an icebreaker and whatever. However, the most important experience I had there I met an Israeli lady. She is a psychologist. She came to Finland with her parents when she was 10 or 11 years old. They just came for the beginning of the year, and in Lapland, the beginning of the winter is that time. The first week was a sport day in school. They had to do cross-country skiing, and there was a competition. All students were supposed to compete. So it was the first time for her to see snow even. So she had no experience, but they said, before you start, we have to give you a grade. What was your previous grade? She said, I've never seen snow. Let's speaking about ice skating or country skiing. So they gave her some fictitious grade. Of course, she came late. She was the last 2 hours after everybody. She fell many times. She felt really a failure. At the end of the day, they called her, and she was the first winner. And they explained to her that in Finland, they appreciate people by how much they improve their previous achievement. And that's an amazing rule. I think it was the most important things I learned at that trip. It's an amazing rule, because if we behave by that rule, then everybody in society have a place. Even people with with limitations and less abilities, they have the ability to do things. And this is it's a very important lesson, because it enables the society also to do other things in a different way, and to know that you don't need to have university education. You can be a good carpenter, you can be a good plumber. Everybody will respect you by how good you do that job and by how much you improve. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me give 2 comments now about a specific driver I consider important, and about a specific barrier to paradigm change I consider important. The first comment is related to the political and economic systems existing today in the world. It has been announced that the economy of China will become the strongest in the world at the end of this year. It is a kind of taboo. Nobody talks about that. And what paradigm is in question? It is socialism with Chinese characteristics. It includes the idea of socialist market economy, which is said to be appropriate since China is in the primary stage of socialism. That's how it is explained. The objective is to formulate and implement the flexible economic policies that will help the country reach the industrial stage. As a result, there is a strong private sector in the country. The question is how to respond to that. I consider that a serious driver for the rest of the world. I would like you to give comments on that. And my second comment is on a specific barrier, as I have had, to the paradigm change. It is related to the new Cold War. The Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, as you know, broke out in 1947, 2 years after the end of the Second World War. The conflict ended in 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The civil war in Ukraine in February this year could be designated as the beginning of the new Cold War. This time between the US and Russia. In March this year, the US and the EU began to introduce economic sanctions to Russia, and Russia immediately responded with the countermeasures. At this moment, it seems that there will be a long-lasting conflict, in fact, between the US and the EU on one side, and with Russia and China on the other side. It seems like that. One can also anticipate that the major losers of this conflict will be the EU, whose wide economic cooperation with Russia, very much needed for ensuring their sustained growth, will be prevented in a long period of time. There are also worries that the conflict might lead to the Third World War. And my question is it a serious barrier to the paradigm change? We think about that and try to obtain some answers. Now, let us continue with the questions and discussions to these two comments and to other comments. Momir, please.
Thank you, presenters, for very interesting speeches. And thank you, Gary, for mentioning that we don't live in democratic society. That's it. The nuclear weapon is not the only reason why we are not living in democratic society. There are many other issues, and it's easy to prove that democracy is just blah blah. But let me come back to what you told. I haven't heard a single word. In my view, the major problem for changing our lives, or whatever you call the new paradigm, that's a conflict with human spirituality and the knowledge. That's a bigger conflict than climate change. There's a bigger issue than mobility or anything else. The reason being very simple. Our spirituality has been changing very slowly, and knowledge has been changing exponentially. We can say spirituality is a really linear process, and knowledge in time is exponential. So human being is going every day to be more between its spirituality and the knowledge or technology practice. And that is especially reason why we have very complicated situation today. On one side, one part of the world goes to globalized world, and another part goes to nationalism. This has been recognized very well even by XQ and everyone else. And the reason being basically spirituality manifested in different ways, ethical, religious, or everything else. So I would like if you can make some comments on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Momir. I'm asking the other participants from the audience to give comments, to pose questions, please. Please.
Augusto Pradetta from Hamburg, Heinrich Schmidt University. It's working perfectly. Thank you for all your comments in these reports on the panel discussions. This is really interesting, and it is interesting perhaps also in another aspect of what was not said. I very much appreciate this initiative of G Global. It is some new form to overcome that kind of split discussion in our very split on the aspects of power, very split world, to do something new. But if we look back, as far as I remember, in my lifetime, every 10 years, we have a discussion like this on changing paradigms, which is necessary to change our insufficient performance, how to deal with the world problems. So my question would be to the panelists and to the reporters, were there any discussions on the researches we have as well, why we did not change the world after 10 years ago, when we had discussions like this? 20 years ago, we spoke about, Mr. Tokayev mentioned it very explicitly, from the 60s, when the Romanov Club began to work, we have that kind of discussion. So to me, it would be very interesting to get to know, is there research on why there was no change in paradigms, taking into account, if this is true, that the problems we had 20, 30, 40 years ago did not decrease but increase. This perhaps is one of the preconditions to talk about the failure of our knowledge on why we did not change in the past. Perhaps this is one of the preconditions to improve something when we talk about education, when we talk about redirecting budgets or something like that. This would be my first question to the panelists. The second question is connected to this. Methodologically, what we heard now is very normative, a very normative discussion. We have to do this or that. We have to do a new kind of spirituality, up to redirecting the budgets for a race, arms race. Yes, we have to do this. But can we talk in this normative way without taking into account that all that kind of things are made by specific actors? Can't we take out of our discussions power relations within that kind of issues we are talking about? So this would be my second question to the panelists. Did you have a discussion about normativity of our discussion, which perhaps is one of the factors we are not proceeding very much from 10 years ago, 20 years ago? Perhaps this is one of our problems we have, that we have too much normative discussion among scientists, people like us who want to have this progress, and not enough discussion on power relations and what power relation has to do with that kind of deficiencies. Thank you very much.
If I may, I'll try to answer both questions, or both comments, the one a moment on values in your question. I think it's quite perceptive. In fact, one of the problems why we do not change the way we do things is we're incredibly short term. And there are actually studies, neuroscientists study this issue, why people will like to take a small advantage right now and not think of the future. For example, there's a very interesting study at Yale. They interviewed a number of people about their opinion of global climate change. And there were people that were just denying because they didn't like that concept. They would not be convinced by a normative discussion. So in fact, I think it's one of the very perceptive things, and one of the biggest barriers ourselves, that we do not have the right wiring to actually proceed in a more logical way, actually have non-logical way. So it's a great frustration for professors.
To pick up the same issue and the question from Gary. The question from Gary was this monopoly of the elite and the leadership to decide what to do in case there is a confrontation which is leading to serious decisions, nuclear weapons, launch, not to launch. And in the discussion in our section, I made a reference in a different context to that. And the context was very much the question, so why the action is not coming, notwithstanding the clear identification of the challenges? Certain things are doable. At the same time, collectively, or whoever it is, the elite of our leaders, it's not getting there. My reference was to the day after, really the day after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So in the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, practically, collectively, we came down. We were very close to that, based on the memories. It did not happen. it was a question of luck. Okay, there was a submarine where the vote or the sort of vote was 2-1 whether to launch or not to launch a 12 kiloton nuclear torpedo, which was the equivalent of a Hiroshima-sized bomb. So it was practically not a privilege of the leaders to manage the situation, but it was the fate, fortunately the positive fate of ours, which enabled us to be here today with you. And one can continue stories from the early 1980s. But what happened was interesting, that a breakthrough, a change of paradigm, happened in the aftermath of those things. So really, the next day after the October fateful days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy and General Secretary Khrushchev exchanged a letter. And both of them committed their country to a comprehensive ban of nuclear weapon tests, which had been an elusive target for 8 years. President Eisenhower, with all the military credentials he had, he couldn't deliver that. So the question is why it was not delivered before, and is it really that those things will have to happen in our life? And if you have a look at the infrastructure of the security, the League of Nations happened after the First World War, not before the First World War. The United Nations was set up after the Second World War, not before the Second World War. And one can continue with treaties which emerged as a result of calamities which we managed to survive. The question is, build the next one, and there is the cyclical repetition of some of these confrontations. Will the next one remain a Cuban Missile Crisis or something worse? And this is food for thought on nuclear issues, on climate change, on many other issues, where the effect is irreversible if the oops, we drop the ball phenomenon is happening.
Very much. And excuse me, okay, Alexander, you are, I'm giving you a word, and then Winston, and that's the end for this session. We have 2 additional days to discuss. We have to stop.
Thank you very much. Just 2 very brief observations. One is historical and related to chronology. As a historian, I cannot just, keep silence on this issue. It is a very popular idea that the Cold War that has started after the Second World War has ended with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Unfortunately, it's ideologically biased and politically biased, this position. I'm sure that those people who lived through that period still will recall that this year, we will celebrate 25th years of the independence of East European countries. It happened in 1989, and it was already the end of the Cold War, because only in the absence of the Cold War that might have happened. Otherwise, it would not. And in fact, the Cold War was ended by the efforts from both sides. And it was the perestroika of the Soviet Union which opened the door, and also, of course, the partnership with the Western leaders of that time, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, Daniel Mitterrand, and others. And they were at that time, let me say, able to take the challenge and to respond to that challenge. It was a prophetic leadership at that time. And by the way, just to preach very, very shortly to the other side of the question about Ukraine, about everything, I think that to a certain extent, I'm not saying that all of it, but to a certain extent, what is happening today with Russia, what is happening today in Ukraine, is related to this political bias, because artificial imposition on Russia the syndrome of a loser in the Cold War created what it should have created. It has created this complex to which Russia, I'm not speaking about the leaders of Russia, I'm talking about the population of Russia. They respond to that. And frankly, I'm surprised, because how can anybody say that Soviet Union people lost the Cold War? What do you mean? 250 million people has opened the road to freedom, to independence, and you call it a loser? I disagree with that strongly. And then the next point to which I wanted to react. I think to a certain extent, all our questions now, not all of them, but some of them, are based on extrapolation. We just extrapolate the current situation to the future. We think, okay, something has happened in Ukraine, there will be the new Cold War, it will continue for another decades. It will not. We live in a totally new world, and actually what is happening today, we are witnessing the tremendous shifts, quantum shifts in the development of the world. And in 10, 15 years, I don't know, maybe we will be very, regretful of the time of today, because the new problems will be much bigger. It could be that. But there will not be linear development as it used to be in the past. So I think that we will deal in 10, 15 years with a completely new situation in international affairs, in production, in distribution and trade, in consumption, in everything. And I think that the goal of this conference is to think about the challenges that we will face, that we face not today, but that we will face in 15 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander, and I'm asking Winston to give his comments, and that will be the end of this session.
Yes, I just wanted to make a short comment on Gary's concern that our session considered cultural but not social issues as deep drivers. That is true. The focus of the speakers and the audience tended to focus on the cultural aspect of it. We did try to interject the issue of social and the values and institutions component to it, but apparently that was not as interesting to the participators. So it doesn't mean that they didn't see those issues as important aspects from the paradigm change side, but they were particularly interested in the issue of culture. Thanks.
Okay, I would like to thank all the speakers. Let me close this session, and let me thank once again to all the speakers, please. Now I'm asking my colleague to give an announcement, please.
Thank you. Let me remind some announcements. According to our conference program, now is the time for coffee break until 4:30 p.m. And after that, the general session, Human Rights and Responsibilities, will be held here in this hall. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.